Between June 12th and June 26th of this year, something happened to Microsoft's cloud infrastructure that most of the people affected by it never even noticed was happening. Over a 2-week window, a single threat actor launched more than 81 million login attempts against Microsoft 365 and Azure accounts. Not 81 million spam emails, not 81 million phishing links, 81 million actual attempts to log directly into real accounts using real, previously stolen usernames and passwords, fired at Microsoft's own infrastructure in an automated, sustained campaign that ran for 2 straight weeks before it was fully understood. To put that number in perspective for a second, 81 million attempts over roughly 14 days works out to an average of nearly 6 million login attempts per day, or close to 4,000 attempts every single minute around the clock for 2 straight weeks. That's not a person sitting at a keyboard trying passwords one at a time. That's industrial scale automation, running continuously, testing credential after credential against Microsoft's authentication systems at a pace no human attacker could ever come close to matching manually. By the time it was caught and confirmed, the attacker had successfully broken into at least 78 Microsoft accounts across 64 different organizations. This is the story of how that happened, why Microsoft's own tools made it possible, and why this is only one piece of what's turning into one of the worst security months Microsoft has had in years. Let's start with the mechanics of the attack, because understanding exactly how it worked explains why the scale here is so staggering. The attacker didn't use some exotic zero-day vulnerability or sophisticated piece of custom malware. They used something far more mundane and far more effective at scale, password spraying, combined with a legitimate Microsoft tool called Azure CLI. Azure CLI is the command line interface Microsoft built for administrators to manage Azure cloud resources, spinning up virtual machines, deploying applications, managing databases, automating cloud operations. It's a genuinely useful, widely used administrative tool, exactly the kind of software real IT professionals rely on every day to do their jobs efficiently. The attacker weaponized that same tool against Microsoft's own users, using username and password combinations harvested from previous unrelated data breaches, the kind of credential dumps that circulate on criminal marketplaces after virtually any major breach, containing millions of email addresses and passwords people reused across multiple services. The attacker systematically attempted to authenticate into Microsoft accounts through Azure CLI's login process. Over 2 weeks, that added up to more than 81 million individual login attempts. At that scale, even a tiny success rate produces real victims. A success rate of roughly 1 in a million attempts, which would sound almost negligible in isolation, still nets you dozens of compromised accounts when you're firing off tens of millions of attempts. This is worth pausing on because it reveals something important about how modern credential-based attacks actually work and why they remain so effective despite being, on a technical level, one of the least sophisticated attack methods available. Password spraying doesn't try to guess passwords randomly. It relies on the simple, well-documented fact that people reuse passwords across multiple accounts constantly, and that data breaches happen constantly across the entire internet. Retailers, forums, gaming platforms, services that have nothing to do with Microsoft at all. Every single one of those breaches adds more raw material to the pool of stolen credentials. Attackers can throw at completely unrelated services, betting that at least some fraction of victims use the same password for their Microsoft account as they did for whatever service actually got breached in the first place. The attacker in this campaign wasn't targeting Microsoft's security directly. They were targeting the much weaker link sitting between Microsoft's genuinely robust infrastructure and the ordinary human habit of password reuse. It's worth being precise about what password spraying actually is, because it's a meaningfully different technique from what most people picture when they hear hacking. Attempt. And the distinction explains why this method has become so persistently effective across the entire industry, not just against Microsoft specifically. A traditional brute force attack targets one account and tries thousands or millions of password guesses against it, which most modern systems easily defend against by locking an account after a handful of failed attempts. Password spraying flips that logic around entirely. Instead of trying many passwords against one account, the attacker tries a small number of common or previously breached passwords against a huge number of different accounts, spacing out the attempts to stay under the threshold that would normally trigger an account lockout. That single change in strategy is what allows an attacker to run 81 million attempts over 2 weeks without getting immediately shut down. Each individual account only sees a handful of attempts, low enough to avoid triggering standard lockout defenses, while the attacker's total attempt volume across every account they're targeting adds up to tens of millions. This specific technique has a long track record of success precisely because it exploits human behavior rather than any technical flaw in the target system. Security researchers have been warning about password spraying as a dominant attack method for years, and the reason it keeps working isn't that organizations aren't aware of it. It's that the underlying behavior it exploits, password reuse across services, remains as stubbornly common, no matter how many awareness campaigns get run. Every single major data breach anywhere on the internet, regardless of what company got breached or what kind of service it was, effectively adds fresh ammunition to this exact style of attack against every other unrelated service on the internet, including services as heavily defended as Microsoft's own infrastructure. It's worth being fair to Microsoft here because this specific attack isn't really a story about a Microsoft vulnerability in the traditional sense. Azure CLI worked exactly as designed. The authentication system correctly rejected the overwhelming majority. Of the 81 million attempts, 78 successful compromises out of 81 million attempts is a success rate of roughly 0.001%, which by most reasonable security standards is actually a strong defensive showing against a brute force style credential attack at this scale. This isn't a story about Microsoft's authentication system being broken. It's a story about how even a well-defended system, operating at the scale Microsoft operates at, still produces real victims purely because of the sheer volume of attempts a motivated attacker can throw at it using entirely legitimate tools. But here's where the story gets more uncomfortable, because this attack didn't happen in isolation. It landed in the middle of what's shaping up to be one of the most difficult security stretches Microsoft has faced in recent memory. And understanding the full picture requires looking at everything else that happened in roughly the same window. Just weeks after this password spraying campaign was disclosed, Microsoft shipped its July 2026 Patch Tuesday update, and it was a record breaker for entirely the wrong reasons. The July release fixed 622 separate Microsoft vulnerabilities in a single update, more than triple the previous high of around 200 flaws set just the month before, in June. 2 of those hundreds of vulnerabilities were already being actively exploited in the wild before the patch even shipped. A privilege, escalation flaw in Active Directory Federation services, the component that provides single sign-on and federated access between an organization's internal systems and external applications, and a separate privilege, escalation flaw in on-premises SharePoint server. Both were serious enough that the U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency added them to its Known Exploited Vulnerabilities catalog, a designation that sets mandatory patch deadlines for federal agencies, specifically because the vulnerabilities are confirmed to be under active attack, not just theoretical risks. The SharePoint situation actually got worse after that patch shipped, not better. A third, separate SharePoint vulnerability, this one carrying a near maximum severity score of a 9.8 out of 10, involving unsafe deserialization of untrusted data that could let an unauthorized attacker execute code over a network, came under active exploitation shortly after Microsoft's July patches went out, according to independent security researchers tracking the situation. CISA had to issue a fresh warning urging organizations running on-premises SharePoint server to implement additional hardening measures, on top of whatever patches had already been applied, because attackers were actively hunting for and exploiting internet-exposed SharePoint instances in real time. That pattern, a patch shipping and attackers immediately pivoting to exploit whatever remained unpatched or under-hardened, is a familiar and frustrating one in enterprise security circles. It reflects a broader reality that patching alone was never a complete solution, only ever one layer of a much larger defense strategy. Once a vulnerability becomes public knowledge through a patch release, attackers immediately reverse engineer the fix to understand exactly what was broken, then race to exploit that same weakness against every organization that hasn't yet applied the patch or the recommended hardening steps. For widely deployed enterprise software like SharePoint, sitting at the center of countless organizations' internal document management and collaboration workflows, that race between patch adoption and exploit development plays out on a genuinely dangerous timeline, often measured in days rather than weeks. That same July update batch also disclosed a BitLocker security bypass. BitLocker being Windows' built-in disk encryption feature, the thing that's supposed to protect your data, even if someone steals your physical laptop. The vulnerability allows an attacker with physical access to the device to bypass BitLocker's protection mechanism entirely. It's not remotely exploitable, so it's a narrower risk than the SharePoint flaws, but it's a genuinely unsettling one conceptually. The specific feature Windows users rely on to protect their data from someone who physically steals their machine has its own documented weakness, sitting in the same record-breaking patch batch as everything else. And separately from all of that, an independent security researcher operating under the handle Nightmare Eclipse released a working zero-day exploit dubbed Legacy Hive, demonstrating a privilege escalation attack that works against fully updated, fully patched Windows systems. Free, unofficial patches from third-party sources circulated before Microsoft had shipped an official fix, which is exactly the kind of situation security professionals dread A working exploit publicly available, actively exploitable, with the only mitigation available coming from unofficial community sources rather than the vendor itself. Layer one more thing on top of all of this. Microsoft's own Windows Server update services, the infrastructure IT departments rely on to actually distribute and synchronize these security patches across their organizations in the first place, was independently reported to be broken for over a week during roughly the same period, causing synchronization failures that left administrators unable to reliably push updates out to their own networks. Think about the layered irony there for a second. In the exact window where Microsoft needed organizations to patch faster than ever, given the record-breaking number of vulnerabilities and multiple actively exploited 0 days, the actual mechanism many of those organizations rely on to distribute those patches was itself malfunctioning, meaning some of the very organizations most exposed to this month's record vulnerability count were simultaneously among the least, equipped to close that exposure quickly, through no fault of their own security teams. Put all of these pieces together and July 2026 stops looking like a routine, if unusually busy, patch cycle. It starts looking like a genuine convergence of pressure points, a massive credential stuffing campaign compromising real accounts through a legitimate administrative tool, a record-shattering vulnerability count with multiple flaws already under active attack before the fixes even shipped, a maximum severity SharePoint flaw that kept generating new exploitation activity after the official patch, a BitLocker bypass undermining Windows core data protection promise, a publicly released working exploit against fully patched systems, and the actual patch distribution infrastructure breaking down at the worst possible moment. No single one of these stories on its own would necessarily be alarming. Large software companies patch hundreds of vulnerabilities every month, and isolated incidents happen. It's the clustering, all within the same few weeks, that makes this month genuinely different. It's worth talking about why Microsoft specifically ends up at the center of security. Stories like this so often because it's not simply that Microsoft's software is worse than everyone else's. That would be an unfair and inaccurate conclusion to draw from this data alone. It's that Microsoft's software runs an enormous share of the world's business infrastructure. Windows dominates the desktop OS market. Azure is one of the 2 or 3 largest cloud platforms on the planet. Microsoft 365 handles email, documents, and collaboration for a huge percentage of the world's organizations, from small businesses to government agencies. SharePoint and Active Directory Federation services sit at the core of enterprise identity and document management for a massive share of corporate IT environments. When a system is that deeply embedded across that much of the world's infrastructure, it becomes, almost by definition, the single most attractive target available to any attacker looking to maximize their return on a successful breach. Attackers go where the victims are concentrated, and there's no more concentrated target on the planet right now than Microsoft's ecosystem. That concentration is worth sitting with for a moment, because it's exactly the kind of structural risk that rarely gets discussed in the day-to-day coverage of individual vulnerabilities. When the overwhelming majority of the world's businesses, schools, hospitals, and government agencies all run authentication, email, and document management through the same handful of interconnected Microsoft systems, a single credential stuffing campaign or a single actively exploited 0 day doesn't just threaten one company, it threatens a meaningful slice of global digital infrastructure simultaneously, because so much of that infrastructure shares the exact same underlying dependencies. That's not a uniquely Microsoft problem in principle. Any sufficiently dominant platform would carry the same concentration risk, but Microsoft's specific dominance across desktop operating systems, enterprise identity, and cloud infrastructure simultaneously puts it in a genuinely unusual position of being a single point of attractiveness for attackers across an enormous range of attack surfaces at once. This kind of concentration risk has a name in security circles: monoculture risk, borrowed from agriculture, where planting a single crop variety across an entire region makes that entire region simultaneously vulnerable to any single disease or pest that happens to target that specific variety. The digital equivalent is exactly what we're watching play out this month. An enormous share of global business infrastructure running on tightly interconnected systems from a single vendor means that vendor's bad month becomes, functionally, everyone's bad month simultaneously. Diversifying which vendors and platforms an organization depends on isn't just about avoiding any one company's specific mistakes. It's about reducing how much of your own organization's security posture is determined by decisions and incidents entirely outside your control, happening inside one company's infrastructure that millions of other unrelated organizations also happen to depend on at the exact same time. It's worth connecting this specific attack to a much larger shift Microsoft has been pushing across its entire identity infrastructure this year, because the timing makes that shift read very differently than it might have a year ago. Throughout 2026, Microsoft has been steadily moving its entire enterprise identity system, Entra ID, toward a passwordless by default model. SMS and voice-based multi-factor authentication, the codes you get texted or read aloud over a phone call, are being fully retired, with enforcement beginning September 1st, 2026, and native delivery ending entirely by February 2027. In their place, Microsoft is pushing passkeys, credentials based on public key cryptography, rather than a password or a code that can be intercepted or, crucially, reused across services the way a stolen password can be. After February 2027, passkey registration becomes mandatory for all users across all tenants, with no opt-out available at all. Seen against the backdrop of an 81 million attempt password spraying campaign, that shift stops looking like an abstract enterprise IT policy update and starts looking like a fairly direct acknowledgement of exactly the problem this specific attack exploited. Passwords, by their fundamental nature, can be stolen once and reused indefinitely across any service where a victim reused that same password. A passkey, tied cryptographically to the specific device and service it was created for, simply can't be extracted from a breached database and sprayed against a completely unrelated service the way a password can. Microsoft's own security messaging around this transition explicitly ties the urgency to exactly this kind of credential. Based attack, along with growing concern about AI-powered attack tooling, making large-scale credential stuffing even easier and cheaper to run than it already is. That context matters for understanding why this specific campaign landed as more than just one more entry in a long list of security incidents. It's a real-world, large-scale demonstration of precisely the vulnerability Microsoft has spent the better part of a year explicitly telling its enterprise customers they need to move away from. Whether the passwordless push happens fast enough to matter for organizations still relying on traditional password-based logins today is a separate question entirely. And for the 64 organizations that had accounts compromised in this specific campaign, that transition clearly didn't happen fast enough. Let's get back to the 81 million attempt campaign specifically, because it's worth understanding what actually happened to the 78 organizations whose accounts got compromised and what the practical consequences look like once an attacker successfully breaks in through this method. A compromised Microsoft 365 or Azure account isn't just an inbox someone can read. Depending on the permissions tied to that account, a successful login can hand an attacker access to internal email threads, shared documents, cloud infrastructure controls, and in some cases, a foothold to pivot deeper into an organization's broader network. Security researchers tracking this specific campaign noted that the attack pattern showed signs of being methodical and sustained rather than opportunistic. A threat actor testing credentials against specific organizations over time rather than randomly spraying attempts and hoping for the best, which suggests actual reconnaissance and targeting behind the campaign rather than pure automated noise, and raises the uncomfortable possibility that at least some of these 64 organizations were specifically chosen rather than randomly caught in a wide net. It's also worth noting how this specific incident fits into a broader pattern of attackers increasingly using legitimate, sanctioned administrative tools to carry out attacks, rather than obviously malicious custom malware that security software is specifically built to detect. Azure CLI traffic looks, on a network level, exactly like the traffic generated by a legitimate system administrator doing legitimate work, because technically it is exactly that, just with stolen credentials instead of authorized ones. That makes this style of attack genuinely harder to distinguish from normal administrative activity in real time, compared to more obviously malicious traffic patterns that traditional security tools are tuned to flag immediately. Security teams increasingly have to rely on behavioral analysis, flagging login attempts from unusual geographic locations, unusual times of day, or unusual patterns of resource access, rather than simple traffic pattern detection, precisely because the traffic itself looks completely legitimate on the surface. Attackers increasingly understand that living inside a system's own legitimate tools, rather than bringing in, obviously, foreign malware, is one of the most effective ways to avoid detection for as long as possible. So what's the actual takeaway here, both for organizations relying on Microsoft's ecosystem and for anyone watching this pattern from the outside? It's not that Microsoft is uniquely negligent. The response to this specific campaign, once detected, appears to have been reasonably competent. And a 0.0001% success rate against 81 million attempts is not, on its own, evidence of a broken system. But the sheer volume and diversity of security pressure Microsoft's ecosystem is absorbing right now, credential attacks at massive scale, record-breaking vulnerability counts, multiple actively exploited 0 days, a core encryption feature with its own bypass, and patch distribution infrastructure breaking down at the worst possible moment. paints a picture of a company whose sheer scale has made it the central pressure point for an enormous share of the internet's security risk all at once, whether it wants that position or not. For organizations and individuals who've built their entire digital lives around Microsoft's ecosystem, Windows on the desktop, Microsoft 365 for email and documents, Azure for cloud infrastructure. This month is a useful, concrete reminder of exactly what that concentration actually means in practice. It's not that alternatives are automatically safer purely by virtue of being smaller or different. Smaller platforms carry their own risks, and security through obscurity is not a real strategy. But there's a genuine, measurable difference between a security incident affecting one narrow slice of infrastructure and a security incident capable of rippling across authentication, email, cloud compute, and document management simultaneously, purely because all of those systems happen to be tightly interconnected within the same company's ecosystem. Diversity of infrastructure, running some workloads on different platforms, avoiding total dependency on a single vendor's authentication system for absolutely everything, isn't just an abstract philosophical preference. It's a genuine practical hedge against exactly the kind of concentrated risk this month has put on full display. If your organization runs on Microsoft 365 or Azure, the most immediate, practical takeaway from this specific story isn't panic. It's basic credential hygiene, applied seriously rather than as a checkbox exercise. Enable multi-factor authentication everywhere it's available, and specifically don't rely on SMS or voice-based MFA, which Microsoft itself has been actively phasing out in favor of phishing-resistant passkeys for exactly this reason. Audit for password reuse across your organization, because that's the entire mechanism this specific attack depended on. And if you're an IT administrator responsible for patch deployment, this month is a genuine concrete argument for verifying that your update distribution systems are actually functioning correctly, rather than assuming they are, given that WSUS synchronization failures during this exact window left some organizations patching slower than the threat landscape demanded. It's worth adding one more practical point here, specifically for individual users rather than IT administrators, because this story isn't purely an enterprise problem. If you've ever reused a password across a personal Microsoft account and any other service, a shopping site, a forum, a game, this exact style of attack is a direct, concrete reason to stop. You don't need to wait for Microsoft's mandatory passkey rollout to protect yourself. Enabling a passkey, or at minimum, an authenticator app-based MFA method today on your own personal account closes off exactly the attack vector 81 million login attempts were built to exploit. It takes a few minutes, and unlike most security advice that asks you to trust a company's internal processes, this is something entirely within your own direct control right now. If you want to see how this connects to the bigger pattern we've been tracking on this channel, a company whose sheer scale keeps generating security and reliability pressure across everything it touches, from secure boot certificate transitions to WSL, networking failures to now this, the other videos covering those stories are linked right here, because taken together, they build a much clearer picture of what it actually means to have that much of the world's digital infrastructure concentrated in one company's hands. Let me know in the comments if your organization got caught up in this specific campaign, or if you've already made the multi-factor authentication changes. This story is a pretty direct argument for. And if you're watching this as someone who's already made the move to Linux or is considering it, this kind of story is worth factoring into that decision, honestly. Not because Linux systems are immune to credential attacks. They aren't. But because spreading critical infrastructure across more than one vendor's ecosystem is one of the few genuinely effective hedges against exactly the kind of concentrated risk this month has put on full display. Subscribe if you want to keep tracking exactly how much pressure Microsoft's ecosystem keeps absorbing and what that pressure ends up costing the people depending on it.